Hi everyone, welcome back to Digital Law News. This has been brought to you by Anson Evaluate. So just to introduce myself, I am Laura Spencer and I'm an apprentice solicitor at Digital Law UK. So Digital Law is a law firm focused on law applying to digital and technology matters, including international e-commerce, regulation, data protection, international data transfers and cybersecurity data privacy. So I'm joined today by my Managing Director, Peter Wright. So if you just want to introduce yourself, Peter.
Thank you very much, Laura, and hello everyone. So the purpose behind our webinar today is to just give people a flavour in terms of the sorts of things we tend to discover in our weekly meetings at Digital Law when we're looking at the main issues that are in the news each week that we need to be mindful of when we're advising our clients. And it gets so interesting, we thought, you know what, we thought everyone else would be interested in hearing about it as well. So that's the purpose behind these updates, which we're hoping you'll be able to join us for on a regular basis to hear about the fast-moving world in terms of digital and technology law.
Great, thank you. So we'll move on to our first story today. So the first one that we're going to be talking about today is the new Dubai International Financial Centre data protection law, which actually takes effect on the 1st of July, tomorrow. July already, I don't know how. So this data protection law comes into force tomorrow, like I said, and it aims to closely align the firms that are registered inside the Dubai International Financial Centre with the framework of the EU GDPR. So if you want to kick us off with our talk about it, Peter.
Absolutely, yeah. It's interesting that we're seeing this new law come in at such a time when data protection standards are of great global importance. So we've already got GDPR in Europe. It remains in place in the UK through the UK's Data Protection Act. And it's starting to be seen as a global leader in terms of standards. So you've now got other standards coming in like the California Consumer Privacy Act, as well as other data protection standards in some of the other US states and in other, certainly, for example, in some of the German states, they're enacting slightly stricter versions of it. Yeah. The key thing to bear in mind is that this is a major financial center outside of Europe, outside of the US, saying we are going to make sure that our standards closely reflect and almost mirror what's in place with GDPR. I think the implications of this is several, but certainly for the UK, for example, when we're looking at our data is one of the key issues for the UK government to think about in terms of its negotiations on Brexit with the European Union. And there's talk that the government's thinking, well, we want to have freedom to diverge on standards, to go and move away from GDPR if we wish. But the fact it's being adopted, or some of the principles of GDPR are being adopted so broadly in so many other jurisdictions, really it suggests that, okay, if you've got a clean sheet of paper, adopt whatever standards you want, you're actually going to be pushed gradually in the direction of having something very much like GDPR anyway. And this is regardless of, I suppose, the outcome of those discussions, insofar as this is happening in different areas anyway. So this is happening in Dubai. I think other financial centres around the world will start seeing the dominoes follow in terms of gradually increasing their standards as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a very interesting point. Like, we in the UK are convinced that, well, some people are convinced that we're going to move away from GDPR once we've kind of left the EU now, but after all the whole transition period. But it's quite interesting to see, like you said, that all countries across the world now are adopting things like GDPR. So we're actually going to stay on that. And it would be a bit silly for us to move away from it now, to say that other people are adopting it as well.
Exactly, and that's just it. We do have to bear in mind, and that I think you're right, a lot of people are under the impression, oh, we've left the EU, it's all done, and yet there are still these very important negotiations that continue. Yeah. There will hopefully be a deal of some sort in place come January of 2021, and it will include reference to international data transfers between the UK and the EU, but it will probably end up setting out a structure under which the UK will have to supply its data transfers to the EU in some way, shape or form, and that's going to be a crucial bit of negotiation. But the more this goes on, you almost think, you know what, that element of negotiation actually isn't particularly crucial, because whatever ends up being agreed with the EU, other international standards are going to stop mirroring anyway. So you're pretty much going to be in a position of keeping something very close to what we already have. Which, you know what, for business, when we've got enough things to worry about, we're coming out of lockdown and a difficult recession anyway, to think, you know what, we don't have to change anything with regards to how we're transferring data is probably a good thing in the long run.
Yeah, because a lot of businesses as well have took so long over the past 2 years, trying to comply with GDPR and putting all these practices in place, to completely just scrap that all of a sudden and change it. It just seems a bit silly, really.
I think you're right, and if you think, Laura, about some of the clients that we work with, where they're coming to us struggling to understand the principles around GDPR because of a lot of the confusion around its introduction 2 years ago, where everyone thinks that GDPR is all about consent, and as we know, it's about an awful lot more than that. To then actually throw that out and bring in something else, I think would be more than the market could properly absorb and understand, and you'd just be looking at even more confusion further down the line. So I think keeping the main principles that we have now is probably in everyone's interests, just so that we can at least say, even if we have the freedom as the UK to do what we want, we can say, well, we're going to stick with this, we're going to regulate it ourselves, we're going to use it ourselves, and it means then that we can make sure that, you know, our data protection laws fit in with not just Europe, but with the rest of the world. And actually having our own freedom to do that means that if we want to increase them, if we want to vary them in any way to fit in with things happening in Dubai or in other financial centres, we can then do so.
Yeah, definitely. I completely agree. So if we'll move on to... Oh, did you want to add something else to that?
No, not at all. Let's go on to the next one.
No worries. So our next one is about the report and investigation that the ICO have actually been carrying out. So they've been carrying out a report into, an investigation into the mobile phone extraction, which is carried out by the police. So there was a few concerns that were brought up about this a couple of months ago, probably for the past couple of years actually, and since the GDPR came in and the stricter policies and that came in as well. So a lot of the concerns were regarding excesses in process of the personal data which was extracted from these mobile phones. And since then, the ICO have made a couple of recommendations, which are actually on the slide there, which are to introduce measures to improve compliance with data protection law and to regain public confidence in doing so, and to actually bring in a new code of practice for the police when they are extracting data from people's phones in a criminal investigation.
Yeah, thanks for that, Laura. You've summarised there some very important points. I suppose just to bring everyone up to speed, this addresses the fact that at the moment, when the police turn up a home, say with a warrant, and say, right, we're able to come in and take a look at your property, not only can they go through everything in your desk drawers and in the calendar that's on the fridge or anything else in the property, of course they can also recover your mobile devices like these and then strip all the data off them. And we are not talking here just about the dates of when phone calls might have taken place or text messages. We're talking about all the data on that phone going back to when it was first switched on, and even all the information in social media accounts that are linked with all the information in, for example, WhatsApp, text messaging, Facebook Messenger, all of that. Even if messages have been deleted, the police can recover all of those from the hardware. They can also recover things like GPS data and data in related to every single piece of infrastructure that that device has ever connected to. So every single GPS, every single mast that is connected to, all the GPS location tracking data, all of this stuff can be stripped off the mobile phone and then stored and analysed by the police. So we're talking about huge invasion of privacy. Now, arguably, if the police have got a warrant anyway, you can say, well, look, they're obviously investigating here. They have reasonable cause and suspicion, which has been confirmed when the warrant was granted. But I mean, I've spoken to a lot of Crown Court judges, and I think sometimes they aren't necessarily aware of the sheer breadth of data that's actually then being obtained when these devices are scanned by law enforcement.
Yeah.
And that's where I think this new code of practice is so important. In particular, if we think, what about if all this data is harvested, the police keep hold of it, they don't end up proceeding with the investigation, but then 3 years later you're arrested for something else, and then they use the data that they previously obtained and go, well, we took this off your phone back then, so we know that you communicate with XYZ. We know that so-and-so is a friend of yours, or we know that you go to this area regularly, and that could be used potentially against you.
Yeah.
And of course, GDPR says don't keep data for longer than is necessary. And I think that's one of the key things, at least in this code, that might refine that.
Yeah, I think this all comes down to like the legal basis as well. Obviously, we know from GDPR you need a legal basis in order to process personal data, and you need to inform the data subject if you are using that data for a different purpose. So obviously, if they're collecting that data for that specific investigation, using that data again and again and again in your different investigations, surely isn't right.
Exactly. So it would be a fairly fundamental breach that you'd be talking about there, yet it seems to be very often ignored. And I think it also comes down to just a lack of training within police and law enforcement as a whole. In some instances, they've ended up bringing in contractors to do this work for them. And of course, they're just coming in saying, what do you want doing? They bring in the hardware, they strip this stuff off the phone, and that's it. So it really is a matter of, with this code of practice, but having the good training behind it so that the police will then know how they're supposed to be handling this data, and it then won't be kept for longer than it should be, and it won't end up being retained for potentially years at a time when the investigation it was collected for has long since passed.
Yeah, definitely. So just moving
on to the next story.
Yep, that's fun. So the next one is about the age-appropriate design code, which is coming to Parliament. So I think this came into Parliament a few weeks ago. It's been brought in front of them. So this is in huge steps towards protecting children online, especially given the increased use on online services due to the coronavirus. So like a lot of kids are obviously now being homeschooled and using online lessons and things like that. So the code sets out 15 standards that online services should meet in order to protect children's privacy.
Yes, and I think, as you say, Laura, it's really important that this is now being refined and is before Parliament at a time when, let's face it, in January we didn't think that the majority of the nation's school children will be doing their learning at a distance, at home environment on home equipment, not equipment provided for them in school, where there are risks, as we know, of the things that they can potentially stumble upon that you really wouldn't want your children to be looking at. Anything from sometimes very violent content through to things that are just very unsuitable and that you wouldn't want a child, which as far as the data protection legislation is concerned, is 13 below 13 years of age. There's still an awful lot there that you might not necessarily want your child looking at.
Yeah, definitely. I think this comes back to what we were actually talking about the other day as well. I know when I was younger, I didn't have all these devices, and I didn't get a phone until I was about 13, and I didn't get a laptop that I could use every day. So I think there does need to be these regulations and things in place to protect the children, because thinking about it, back then, there was kind of no need for it. But I think the increase now, like children have laptops, children have like iPads all the time from being a very small age. So there does need to be something there to protect them, I think.
Indeed, and I think the whole effect of this lockdown we've just gone through is that we're seeing a massive increase in terms of people living their lives online, relying on digital technology for everything from learning and skills through to buying things, retail, food and goods, etc. And it means that children are then relying on the internet in a way that they weren't having to do just a few years ago. And famously, kids end up receiving sort of hand-me-down devices from parents. The iPhone and the tablet that parents no longer need ends up being passed down. And sometimes there is that potential risk that, well, you think that they're just going on it to look at schoolwork, or they might be just going on it to play games with their friends, considering that they can't go outside and play games, then they're going to be inside and having that element of a social life at least there and able to play online role-playing games, etc., all these different things. But all it takes is a couple of keystrokes, and you can find yourself then scrolling through some really quite unpleasant content. And I think there is a balance on this. I think to some extent people then get worried about, well, are we talking here about censorship and the nanny state? But I think there is enough evidence out there, instances of children seeing this sometimes really graphic content and finding it quite damaging to have seen that stuff, to think that we really do need to start thinking about how we handle this, and hence having this appropriate design code would be is definitely a good step on that road.
Yeah, definitely, I agree. Yeah, I think it's about time that something came in with this. Obviously not as extreme, like not stopping everything, not censoring everything, but just to regulate things and actually stop them from seeing maybe some graphic stuff like you mentioned.
And it's important as well that it's very much a design code, so it's going to be hopefully something that web designers, those that are designing infrastructure, those that are developing systems, will think about this when they're designing their systems. And in a similar way to we end up advising our clients with regards to doing data protection impact assessments. As part of that, if you're developing a new system, you should be thinking, well, what if we have a minor in effect coming on and using this system? What safeguards do we have in place? And that's got to be, particularly for those who are then designing these systems in the future, they have to be thinking about that, and being able to have some safeguards in place has got to be something that they consider right at the outset. You can't sort of come up with your new system with all these bells and whistles and then at the last minute go, oh, what do we do to make sure that this has got some controls in place? It's going to be something that's done at the start of the design process rather than at the end.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, like you said, you already have to think about children, like under the age of 13, when you're thinking of your website from a data protection standpoint. So this is just really adding to that and just extending it a little bit further.
Exactly. Should we move on to the next item?
Yeah. So our next one is about football, the return of the Premier League and other leagues now as well. So this is all about avoiding scoring a cyber own goal when streaming Premier League league football. So the NCSC have recently warned online people that online hackers could break into football fans' accounts to carry out phishing attacks. And I think one of their main recommendations is in terms of your password, making sure you've got a strong password and not daisy chaining your password, and all them other recommendations that we usually recommend when saying about your email and things like that as well.
Indeed. The risk from phishing and indeed targeted spear phishing continues to proliferate online. And the fact that suddenly we've got these games for the remainder of this season, not just in terms of Premier League. I mean, this very much applies to Premier League, but I mean, also when it comes to some of the international games, so Champions League, semi-final and final, and the climax of those competitions is all going to be on a basis that it's streamed far more broadly than has previously been the case, which is great. So you can sit and watch it on a tablet or on a phone. But then there is the risk when you're consuming this stuff online that then it can potentially be hacked. I think if memory serves as well, that National Cybersecurity Centre article refers to the fact that, funnily enough, if you're a football fan and you open up an account on this, very often you use your football team as the password, which is a natural thing to do. But I think there's the stats in there that say how easily hacked that is. So if someone just types in, Newcastle 123 or Liverpool 2020, that's going to be incredibly easy to be hacked. And then they could potentially get in there. They can access your account. They can, if they're into that account, can they get into other accounts? Can they start then getting control of your mobile device? Once you've given them a way in, it's the start of a slippery slope, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think we were saying as well, it's not just like having a strong password. It's obviously they could send phishing emails as well. So because there's a lot of people on these like streaming links, if it crashes or something, they could then send an email, and then you might click on the links. They might say something like, "Oh, click here to rejoin the stream. It's too many people watching," and then you're not actually clicking on the stream. You're clicking on something else.
Indeed, that's absolutely right. So it's it's frequently the way. Imagine the frustration of you've just seen a great period of play and you think, great, something's going to happen, and then the signal cuts out because the system is overloaded. If you were to then get an email and a notification that comes through on your screens from purporting to come from the streaming company saying, oh, system's gone down, click here.
Yeah.
The temptation to click on that would be very, very high. I think the other thing to bear in mind is that these streaming services do often crash a lot. I've got friends that watch the F1 TV system and try and rely on that in various parts of the world to watch Formula One races, and they get very frustrated paying a lot of money and then having a really poor signal, so you can't actually see that crucial overtaking maneuver. And that you'd be very receptive at a point where you are frustrated at what you've paid for or what you've set aside time to watch being interrupted. That then, if a well-timed phishing email was sent, I think it would have quite a high click-through because everyone would just, oh great, I can click on here and actually see it. And I dread to think what could then happen, unfortunately.
I know, yeah. I can imagine that a lot of people would fall for things like that.
And again, these are the sorts of risks that we would never really have been talking about only a few months ago, because who thought there'd be mass streaming of Premier League football outside of their multi-billion-pound deal with the satellite TV companies? But suddenly we're in a world where, yeah, this stuff is being streamed more broadly, and these problems will then become even greater.
Yeah, this is the new norm.
Or the new abnormal, as I keep calling it.
Yeah, that sounds a bit better. So just moving on to the next one.
Yes.
This is also referring to the NCSC. So this is an article that was on the NCSC website, I think. And it might be on the government website, actually, this one. So this is one that says, thanks a million, British public help reach major milestone in the fight against scammers. So recently there's been an influx in cryptocurrency scams. So the NCSC actually launched a suspicious email reporting service, which actually launched in April. And since then, 10,000 links have been reported to NCSC through this service, and over half of them have now been blocked or taken down. So the amount of people who've actually saved their money and like not been scammed through this one service is outstanding, really.
It is, and it's one of the positive things that the NCSC has been able to do, because certainly from the time that the lockdown hit, and very often we then became dependent on going online for all of our sources of news, then not everyone's well informed on what is genuine advice from, for example, government or the NHS, and what is potentially a scam. So it's great that the NCSC have been able to take down these potentially fraudulent links, but it also reflects the fact that there are millions of COVID-related emails being blocked by the Gmail servers and by Microsoft, their servers, on a daily basis. So there is a huge amount of misinformation out there. Just to give, when people are thinking, well, what do I mean when I say a COVID-related scam? A friend of mine received a phone call that was purported to come from Test and Trace saying, oh, you've had COVID, or a friend of yours has had COVID, so you need to have a test. You have to pay £60. Please go ahead and pay it. And they were literally demanding, credit card info. And thankfully, the friend of mine was on the ball enough to know that the official UK Test and Trace app isn't up and running, and he hadn't been anywhere where he could have met anyone. So it was like, this is a total scam. And furthermore, tests through the NHS are of course free. That's the point of the NHS. So it was a total scam. And he was able to tell the caller where to go. But if you weren't sufficiently up to speed on that, you might feel, particularly when someone says, oh, we think that you've got a really serious disease that's potentially fatal, you might panic into handing over your credit card information. And the same thing goes for emails and text messages that you might receive that might say, this is the official Test and Trace, please click here to access information, or please and give us money for a test, or purporting to demand money for some other sort of service. anything like that should be ignored at all costs. Anything that is genuine, they're not going to turn around and ask you for money. And my understanding as well is that if the genuine test and trace people do get in touch, then they're just going to say, you've got to go along to your nearest testing centre. Funnily enough, our office, the Digital Media Centre, in the car park there, they've actually got a official testing station set up, which is being run by the British Army. So, you know, those are the places where you need to go to for a test. Don't trust someone online who tries to sell you money, make you pay money for that. You should be able to go to these different stations up and down the country.
Yeah, I think like you said as well, for most people it is kind of obvious, but for some people who might not be, so like maybe the older people or the younger people who don't really know what's going on, well, it's good to know that something that should be done about these scams.
Exactly. I mean, they'll always prey on the vulnerable, so it'll always be either someone who's young or the very elderly. I mean, bless them, my 94-year-old aunt had someone call from purporting to be from HMRC, saying that she had an urgent tax demand, to which she turned around and said, you know, darling, I haven't worked anywhere for 35 years, so I'm pretty sure it's not me. But she was smart enough to do that. But for someone who is living on her own and has been, you know, on her own for the last 3 months during lockdown, that is a bit of a scary situation where you might, if the phone hasn't been going and then suddenly you get someone calling and saying that, it might panic you into doing something that you might otherwise regret, because this stuff is scary if you aren't familiar with it.
Yeah, definitely. And I know, like you said, your auntie did that. My nan and granddad, they're still in the late 70s, and I know they'd probably question it. I mean, they'd probably be like, oh, well, I need to pay this. Laura, can you come up and help me? So yeah, I think it is just knowing about it, and it's good that people are actually talking about it and actually doing something.
Indeed, but of course, a lot of people don't necessarily have a Laura who can then help them and say, stop, don't do that.
Yeah, definitely. So moving on to the next one. This is a very topical one. So I'm sure this has been in the news quite a lot actually recently. So you've probably heard about it. So the Australia were actually targeted by a sophisticated cyber attack by a state-based actor, which means that rather than it being an individual or a company, it was like an estate that targeted Australia. So this affected a range of sectors across Australia, including all levels of government, industry, political organisations, health, education, and so on. And since then, the government have actually been quite open about the attack, even though there's been no evidence that data has been breached or that any data subjects have actually been affected by this. The government have been very open in terms of talking about the attack and sharing things about their investigation.
Indeed. This is probably, out of all the stories that we have today, this is the scary one. Because increasingly governments can now take lumps out of each other by sometimes launching quite sophisticated cyber attacks at each other that could cause real damage. In this instance, it says there's no evidence that data was actually breached, but it looks like certain systems were accessed, and it looks like there are several states out there that we know are quite aggressive in how they end up being behind these attacks. So North Korea is one, Iran is another, and China is another, and they've been known to do attacks. I mean, a couple of years ago, people may remember that the North Korea ended up actually hacking Sony Pictures because Sony went and produced a movie that was seen to be a bit critical of the North Korea and its leadership. And as a result, they ended up hacking into Sony Pictures. Iran has a branch of its military that is responsible for cyber warfare, and they've been known to take whole cities off their power grids. And then also there's been renowned that the Chinese state also has quite significant capabilities as well. Now, in this instance, okay, they've taken a look at these different systems in Australia. And Australia's been very open about the fact that it was on the receiving end of this attack. But of course, some countries would see it as they would be sufficiently embarrassed that they would try and not confirm that they had been the victim of such an attack if they could possibly help it. But the real thing that this reveals is that increasingly an awful lot of damage could be done through a cyber attack. Anything from permanently putting down either a city or a country's electric grid, the water, other utilities. I mean, imagine if suddenly you wake up one morning, there's no electricity, the traffic lights outside aren't working, the gridlock that would happen, the fact that trains couldn't run. That could be done, and we'd be talking here about not putting a system just offline. We could be talking about permanently disabling a whole grid in a country. So there is huge damage that can be caused through some fairly straightforward cyber attacks by one country to another, and the effects would be pretty catastrophic. And therefore, it's quite scary when we see state actors like this taking lumps out of each other. And I hope that this is indeed just one isolated incident, and that isn't the fact that Australia's been very open about this, when in fact it could be that there are dozens of other countries out there that have been on the receiving end of similar attacks, but they simply haven't wanted to talk about it. Yeah,
definitely. I think as well, I was reading another article about it today when I was putting this presentation together, and Australia, this is like, from this attack, they've noticed that they need to up their game in terms of cybersecurity, and they're now investing millions and millions into their cybersecurity for their government and the state as a whole, so that this doesn't happen again.
Indeed. So I think they're doing something similar to what the UK has already done. So everyone will have seen we've had several links from the UK National Cybersecurity Centre, which is supposed to defend a lot of UK infrastructure from hostile attacks. There is also a specific centre that is set up to deal with potential threats to critical national UK infrastructure. So anything from power stations to banks to server farms to all of this critical infrastructure upon which we all rely every day is protected, not just in the real world. So the idea is, you know, to protect this stuff from a terrorist attack, but also to protect it from attacks online, because if anything, even more damage could be caused online than could be done in the physical, in the real world.
Yeah, definitely.
Don't have nightmares, I think, is the summary from that one, I'm afraid.
Yeah, definitely. So the next one, this is obviously very prevalent at the minute, with pubs and bars and restaurants and other hospitality industries open back up on Saturday. So this is about the government guidelines. I've actually linked there. So these slides will be available to anybody who wants them after this. So if you want to drop us an email at admin@digitallawuk.com, we'll be able to send the slides over to you. So this is about the need for companies such as pubs and restaurants and bars to actually collect their customers' data when they visit the pub in case there is an outbreak. So then they can contact everybody who was in the pub on that date or time.
Indeed, we're talking probably about the biggest mass collection of people's personal data in history. Yeah. With regards to this, when you think about the requirements that are being put on businesses, everyone from the smallest little bar or restaurant to make sure that they're collecting the data on everyone that comes to their establishment is quite incredible. I mean, just think of the difficulties of doing this. If you think they're doing this on, you know, Saturday the 4th of July, when ordinarily people would just turn up and think, oh, I might have a few beers in this bar, move on somewhere else, have a few beers in there. You might have people that join the group, people that then leave, and how do you keep track of that in terms of who's where and when is going to make this tracking and testing exercise incredibly difficult. So the government is trying to put the onus onto businesses here to say you should be collecting this data. And they've put out these guidelines, but we know that there's a lot of confusion amongst, I think, the hospitality sector in terms of what they need to do. And we're actually doing a separate self-contained webinar that will be going out later this week on this very subject. So if you are in the hospitality sector, if you run a bar or a restaurant and you're worried about opening your business on the 4th of July or shortly thereafter and thinking, how am I going to cope with this? How am I supposed to collect this data? How do I look after it? How do I stop the risk of being fined, then please do feel free to take a look at our separate webinar, which is being run solely on this subject. It's such a big subject, we couldn't hope to cover it all in our discussion today. But as a starting point, take a look at that guidance there on .gov.uk. It's not the most detailed in the world. More guidelines are supposed to be following from the government, but let's face it, we're only 4 days away from the 4th of July, and it's got to come out fairly quickly. So it's a matter of being very, very careful about the decisions you now make with regards to opening up. And the thing we'll flag up is careful about the systems that you might start using. If they allow people to book a table or book a drink or do their, book a round through there, the standards you need to think of in terms of the security of that data and what happens to it is incredibly important. So think very, very carefully before just, for example, using a free app online or using something just because a friend running another establishment might have said, oh, this is fine, go ahead and use that. That might not necessarily be the endorsement that you want. You want to make sure that you're using something that's safe and secure and that you aren't then at a risk of finding yourself falling foul of the UK's data protection laws.
Yeah, because I think as well, when people first see this, like when I first saw this article about it, when I was looking for someone the other day, the only thing I thought about was handing your name in, your telephone number, maybe your address when you're going through the door. But it's similar like when you go to Wetherspoons now, before all this happened. I know I use the app all the time and I order my drinks from there, and they probably saw my payment details, everything on there. So if every single bar that you go to is doing this, imagine how many people have your personal data without you even thinking. And like you said, if they just use a quick, like a free app from Google or something, they can't guarantee that these data protection policies are in place. So businesses need to think about it before, but it's just running out of time now, isn't it?
Exactly. This is all being done at such tremendous speed that it putting a huge burden really on businesses to try and get everything in place. Now, I understand that people want to get their business open, and if you, particularly when Q3 rent payments for businesses for their premises were due last week, and I imagine an awful lot of people in the hospitality sector are just desperately trying to hang on at the moment, and therefore thinking about the security of data might not be at the top of your mind when you're thinking about being able to meet payments on your lease and pay your staff, pay your suppliers, and desperately trying to keep a business going. But you are being obliged to collect a huge amount of data here, and you don't want to find yourself falling foul of either the government saying, oh, we know that someone with COVID was in your establishment, and then if you can't provide those records, you wouldn't want to be the person that means that it's not possible to properly then trace people who might have been affected by that, and you wouldn't as well want to find yourself on the receiving end of investigation or fine from the ICO because of a cyber attack, for example. But if you're collecting all this data and it's not being secured safely, there will be a risk. So I think that's all we can really say on that for now. Take a look at the information there, and if you are in that sector and you're wanting to hear more, then please take a look at our separate webinar, which will be going up. I think we're hoping to put that out tomorrow. So that will be from Wednesday, the 1st of July, and it will be on our website and on the YouTube channel, and you'll be able to access that. Any questions, just drop us a line, admin@digitallawuk.com.
Yeah, like you said, we'll be putting the webinar up on his website, and we'll be doing some social media posts about it as well to try and spread the word about it. Moving on to the next one, I think this is its final one as well. Yep, it is. So this one is just about some guidance that the ICO put out. So it's about the coronavirus recovery, 6 data protection steps for organisations. So this is all about not specifically any sector in particular, but I think it's when people are returning back to work and thinking about they might have to collect more data than usual and things like that, that they're only like collecting the data that is necessary and only using it for what is necessary, trying to keep all the data that is collected to a minimum, being clear, open and honest with staff and other data subjects, like you said, when people are coming into the pub, make sure you're telling them, right, this is for the track and trace. I need your name and your number because of that, not because I need your name and your number for a different reason, making sure you treat people fairly as well, and keeping people's information secure. And then obviously as well, making sure staff and other people are able to access their information rights just as they would on a normal day-to-day basis.
Indeed, yes. I think it's interesting that this information and guidance is so crucial, and yet it's not something that I think has really received much publicity.
Yeah.
We're aware of it in sort of areas that we undertake our research on a regular basis, but I don't see, you know, when I go on LinkedIn or Facebook or Twitter, I'm not seeing loads of people referring to this guidance, which I think is a slight concern. I think the key thing to bear in mind here as well is that this can refer to some of the other data that might be collected now by businesses. So say you're running an office or a business where you've got a lot of people who you know are going to be coming in, you know, factory, etc. Many businesses are now actually going to be taking people's temperature before they enter. Yeah. I've seen about some organizations that have said we'll either take a temperature, or they're even thinking of having those big heat scanners. So they'll have a physical image, a heat map of each person as they go in. And apparently these things are so accurate that it would show a sort of a warm spot around your head and neck and upper torso if you've got COVID, which is a bit scary. But the whole thing with this, of course, is that if you're taking someone's temperature or you're taking a thermal map of them, that could still be personal data, in particular if you're requiring someone to, for example, say scan their name as they go in, and you're then going to scan the name alongside the image or the temperature and put that on a file. That's all very rich, very sensitive personal data, and that has to be looked after just as rigorously as all the other personal data that an organization looks after. But as we know, when you catered for putting together your data protection standards when it came to GDPR, you might not have been thinking about having to collect people's temperatures or scan their temperature. Nor, you know, we're talking about collecting data that 6 months ago, no one would have thought it was remotely possible that we would have to do this sort of exercise, yet here we are. And these are the measures that an awful lot of companies are now carrying out, but data protection law still applies. So this is really flagging up to say, I mean, we've talked about the hospitality data on the previous slide. This is just saying any other extra data that you now start collecting, even if it's just where you're asking your staff to sign in or to take any additional measures in, for example, you know, people signing for PPE, all these sorts of things, that could be acquiring more personal data, and you've got to make sure that that is going to be processed and stored in just as secure and safe a manner as all of the other personal data that you may be processing with regards to employees, with regards to visitors to the office, any other third parties, etc. So it's a matter of still applying this envelope to it, which, again, when we're working at speed trying to cope with these requirements is a big ask. But the ICO is just trying to say, don't forget about data protection ultimately with these steps.
Yeah, I think it is that as well. I think the advice that they've given in this article is very basic, if you can say, in a way. There's not much of it, and it's not very detailed, but it's just the minimum things that you need to remember. It's just reminding you that although it is a busy period and although you're trying to get back to normal, you can't just forget about data protection and all this. That's still got to be at your front of your mind when you're going back to work and doing all these tests and things like that. Yeah.
And it's also the fact that we'll be dealing with instances that are going to be very sensitive for some people. I mean, if someone, if you get an email into HR from someone and they say, I wasn't feeling very well and I've just tested positive for COVID, you know, that's not the time to then do an a staff-wide email to say, oh, so-and-so's got COVID, we've all now got to get tests. You know, it's going to be a matter of then that person's not going to want that information divulged. It's very personal, sensitive personal data. They're not going to want it broadcast that they are ill and it might have spread this. They could be very embarrassed, particularly if they've been desperate to come to work and they may have worked for a few days, and it could be that they've therefore been asymptomatic before having this test, and they're going to be incredibly embarrassed that they might have made their friends and colleagues ill. So, you know, we have to be very mindful about not sort of broadcasting the fact that someone might have tested. We've got to be also very mindful of the fact that if your company is, for example, if it's obtaining tests for staff and storing any of that data, making sure that that is ring-fenced and can't be potentially breached or inadvertently forwarded to the wrong person, for example. So we have to be very, very alive to the real risks that people are going to have with regards to keeping control and confidence in what could be very sensitive, confidential medical and patient data.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's summed up very good. So I think that's everything for today, actually.
It is. I wish we could have finished on a slightly more positive note, but I think we've covered some useful things there. So thank you, Laura, for putting together that summary for us today.
No worries at all. Yeah, I think we could have finished on a more positive note, but there's not much positive in the news at the minute. So hopefully it'll pick up a bit more with everything opening back up. So like we said, that's the end of today's discussion. We hope you enjoyed. If you have listening today and you want to email us any feedback, please feel free to email us at admin@digitallawuk.com. And you can also follow us on Twitter at digitallawuk.com, on Facebook, the same name, and on LinkedIn. These webinars will be posted on our YouTube channel and will also be going up on our website. Like we said earlier, these are going to be a weekly occurring event now. So these are going to be every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Unless we change it on, but we'll update you on Facebook or LinkedIn and that. So yeah, thank you for Anson Evaluate for producing this discussion today, and thank you for listening.
Thank you all very much. Goodbye.
Thanks. Bye.